welcome to SQE Pass Rates Explained with BPP. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. This event will be running from 4 till 6 p.m. And will feature a presentation given by our lovely speakers here with us today. In the second hour, we will have a virtual networking session where you will have the opportunity to speak to our speakers in the expo booths, so make sure to hang around to speak to them then. Before we begin, I'd like to make sure to bring everyone's attention to the SQE FAQ page that we've created in collaboration with BPP. It's useful for anyone who is at the beginning of their SQE journey or is in the thick of it. So go check it out. There will be a link in the stage chat. And for more insights into personal experiences with the SQE, make sure to check out our interview with the student ambassador at BPE, Yasmin Essayed, who has shared her SQE insights and journey in that article. So without further ado, I will now introduce our lovely speakers. So my name is Julia Sanislow. I'm a writer at Legal Cheek, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Johnny Hurst, Head of Outreach and Student Recruitment at BPP, and a former City Law Firm partner. I'm also very lucky to be joined by Carolyn Rayson, SQE1 award leader at BPP and former lawyer at Ashurst and Osborne Clarke. And these lovely speakers will be leading our session today. So I will hand over to the both of you without further ado.
Thank you so much, Julia. And it's a pleasure to be here again on the Legal Cheek platform with you, Caroline. We've done a few of these sessions, haven't we, over the years?
Certainly have.
And I think one of the things that, if you're new to the sessions that we do with Legal Chic on the SQE, I think it's fair to say, Caroline, that the SQE is a subject that keeps on giving in terms of there's so many information gaps with candidates. And what have you found as somebody who's in charge of an SQE course in terms of where the gaps are in terms of knowledge, even when they join us on the course?
Well, what I would say, Johnny, is that the gaps are changing over time because people are gradually and out there in the world, people are talking to their friends, maybe from the year above, or their siblings, or other family members who've been through it. So gradually, over the sort of last, say, 4 years, I do think that the whole world has got more knowledgeable about the SQE. But you are right that the nature of the centralized assessment regime means that there are always things that are unclear to people. And actually, even we, as you know, about as expert as it gets, really, people in this area, there are still things we don't absolutely know and that we have to make assumptions about or that we have to ask the SRA about. So I think it's really important for everybody embarking on the SQE or involved in the SQE to understand not to be unduly concerned about the fact that not everything is completely certain or ascertainable, but that's okay. Many, many people pass the SQE, and it is a question of finding your way through it and making sure you're being supported by a really good provider as you do that.
Thank you, Caroline. And just to say, one of the projects I've got on the side, it's a shameless plug. You can see there's a little QR code there on the screen. That's a project I've been running in my own time called SQE TV, which is there to help bridge a lot of those information gaps that people have. I think a lot of people don't know what they don't know, and therefore what we're trying to do with that, and also what we try to do at BPP with students when they join us, is to try and plug those gaps as well. So yeah, you might want to check out SQE TV. There's over 200 videos now. We have over 1 million visits from students. So yeah, we must be doing something right, I think. Right, let's move on and talk about SQE pass rates explained, because there's quite a lot involved in the discussion of pass rates. So what we're going to do, first of all, is just to take you through just a structure of what we're going to cover in the session, and then we'll move on from there. So we'll talk about BPP. We'll talk about very briefly, just for those of you who aren't aware of who BPP are, and I think it would be very helpful if Caroline was to give us an overview of the SQE prior to us talking about the SQE pass rates. And then we'll talk briefly about how to choose the right course for you. But please do make use of the chat that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. What I'm going to do is just to go through before we go any further, do you know if you can hear a dog barking in the background? Can you hear that? That's my dog. He's a 1 foot tall Yorkshire Terrier, and he wants to leave the room. Do you know what? I'm just going to let him leave the room 1 second. And
Shall I pick this up for a second,
yes, I
Johnny,
think you
whilst
should,
you
and
do
I'll
that?
join you literally in
Um,
5 seconds.
there are 0 animals in my proximity, so I'm hoping that there won't be any interventions. So BPP University Law School, you will possibly know people who've joined us over time. We are a provider of education in a whole range of different professional contexts, but the law school has been around for over 40 years, and we have really sorry, it says 30 years there, doesn't it? Over 30 years. We have really very deep experience of preparing solicitors for practice in the UK and actually in lots of other places as well, but we particularly focus on the UK. Now, seamlessly, I'm going to pass back to Johnny, who's going to carry on.
Yeah, thank you. And the 40 years, because we were 10 years doing other professional qualifications before the law school came on board, just in case anyone wondered. Thank you, Caroline. Well, we exclusively train the trainees going to 4 of the top 5 Magic Circle firms. In fact, we work with all the Magic Circle firms when it comes to training of future talent, but we exclusively work with 4 of them for training of future lawyers. And we actually have partnerships with over 600 firms, which we're very, very proud of indeed. Um, and 1 second, let me just get myself. Here we go. Um, each year, as I'm sure you're aware, we will train many students, several thousand, to go on to train as solicitors, whether it's down the apprenticeship route or through the conventional course preparation route. Many students do come to us for their SQE training, and they do so through centres across England, London, Bristol, as you can see, Birmingham, Cambridge, Leeds, Manchester, are all covered there. There's also an online option for you to study, and very importantly to say that the online option we offer is a live taught online session. It's not just here's an app, go figure. There's no tutor input. No, far from it. Our online version is very much a live taught version of what happens in a face-to-face classroom. And the other thing we're incredibly proud of is that no other SQE provider has consistently published pass rates for the SQE as high as BPP's since the start of the SQE. Every time results are published by providers, it seems to be that we are the top of the range, which is very pleasing. And of course, that's something that we're going to focus on in quite a bit of detail in the course of this session. So, Caroline, just briefly before we go on to talk about the actual the SQE pathway, there's just a list of firms here that you can see that many of them instruct, or all these firms instruct BPP for their SQE. Is there a particular reason why you think they come back year on year for us to provide them with tuition?
Well, I think there's a lot of trust that has been built up over the years, really. We have, as we were saying, really solid experience in preparing people previously for the LPC route, now more recently for the SQE route. We have all of our tutors teaching on the SQE programs, and in fact, in many parts of the law school, everybody is a solicitor, or if not a solicitor, a barrister by background. So you and I are both like that. All of our colleagues are the same. So we can consistently draw on our experience from practice, which I think people feel is really valuable to them. And we are, as it says on the slide, a trusted provider to this, wide range of firms.
And it's not just the good and the great, as we would say. It's the smallest firm, who I'm sure are good and great in their own way, to the biggest firm, plenty in between, and niche firms all seem to have great relationships with BPP. So it doesn't matter what type of firm you want to go to, or whether it's an in-house role or in the public sector.
Mm.
We have great relationships with employers, and many of our students will go on to successful careers in all wings of the profession. Right, let's talk about SQE pass rates. But I think before we do, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that we do give some sort of explanation as to the SQE pathway, Carolina, since you are the SQE expert here, as well as me, to talk about it, since you are an award lead at BPP. It's quite a yeah, this summary here doesn't probably do justice in terms of how flexible the pathway is, but I'll let you explain it, and then we'll start to talk about the pass rates.
Yes. So Johnny's right. Don't think about what's presented on this slide as being a series of things you must do in precisely this order. One of the big changes when the SQE regime came in is that you can now sort of, you know, m- adapt your approach to your own circumstances, to the way that it works best for you. But the four things you need to be able to show to the SRA at the point that you want to qualify are first that you have a degree or something equivalent to a degree. Now, most of you, that will be an undergraduate degree that you've achieved either in the UK or overseas. It doesn't have to be a law degree. For the purposes of qualifying for the SQE, you don't have to have a law degree. That is quite a change under this regime, but it is how it has been set up. The second thing you have to be able to demonstrate is that you have passed both SQE 1 and SQE 2. Now, these are centralised assessments which are set by the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and in fact, they set them using an organisation called Kaplan, Kaplan. You may have seen that name about the place. So Kaplan puts on behalf of the SRA, SQE1 exams and SQE2 exams. SQE1 broadly is all about knowledge. So it is assessing your knowledge both of what we think of as underlying law subjects, the kind of things you might do in a degree, like contract and tort and land. But they also assess things that we think of as practice subjects. So things like business law or property practice. Okay, so there's a wide range of coverage of the knowledge you need to be able to answer questions on in SQE1. Once you've passed SQE1 and you've got all of that knowledge, you go into SQE2. Now, SQE2 primarily is an assessment of your ability in certain legal practice skills. So, some oral skills like advocacy and interviewing, but also written skills like legal writing, legal drafting. Important to understand, you need to have all of the SQE1 knowledge behind you because you will use that again when you're undertaking those skills assessments in SQE2. So both SQE1 and SQE2 are really significant assessments to undertake. Once you've passed both of those, the SRA is confident that you have all of the skills and knowledge you need to be able to qualify as a solicitor from that perspective. The third thing on this slide is qualifying work experience, very often referred to as QWE. Now, QWE, again, is a brand new concept in the SQE regime, been around for a few years now, and people are beginning to get used to it, as we've talked about already. So qualifying work experience is 2 years long. So in some ways, it's a bit similar to the old regime that we used to have with the LPC. But the really big difference is rather than having to get yourself a training contract with one provider, 2 years, really high stakes to get hold of that. Now you can use any relevant legal experience really in a range of different contexts. You can have it in up to 4 different organisations. The key thing you need to be able to show to the SRA at the end of the process is that you've got 2 years equivalent of experience of gaining the skills and the abilities of a lawyer, and that can be signed off by somebody who themselves is a solicitor of England and Wales. So we see students using, for example, paralegal experience. We see them using law centre experience. We see them using in-house work that they've done, perhaps in a legal team or in a sort of an adjacent legal team, which quite often will count as QWE. And the key thing, part of the strategy of qualifying under the SQE regime, is to make sure that the combination of QWE you put together makes you a good candidate when it comes to looking for a job at qualification. But the great thing is you don't need to get that kind of cornerstone single job with one organisation for 2 years. You can use a combination of different things. And then the final thing, which hopefully applies to you throughout the whole process, is that you are somebody of excellent good character. Okay, so this isn't a change. This is exactly as we had under the old regime. contrary to what people say in the press, to be a solicitor, you do need to be of good moral fibre. So for most people, there won't be any discussion. But for somebody, for example, who has a previous conviction, that's something you would have to make sure that you discussed very early on with the SRA. So, Johnny, that's the SRA
Yeah.
sort of landscape.
And the thing, just to remind everybody, and I'm sure you might have heard this before, but bearing in mind there are a lot of people who come onto these webinars for the first time, that we are maybe going over some ground that you do not have to do all these things sequentially. The only thing that's sequential in that is that you can't start SQE2 until you've passed SQE1, or you can't take the SQE2 exam until you've passed SQE1. But apart from that, you can do your qualifying work experience before, during, or after your SQE journey, or mix and match it in different episodes or periods of qualifying work experience. Right, now we did promise you to talk about pass rates. Just before we do, we're now going to focus on SQE1, and Caroline started to explain a little bit about the way that SQE1 was made up, partly from the black letter law subjects that many people will cover as part of their law degree or conversion course, which you can see in blue there, and then the black subjects are the new ones. Just very briefly, Caroline, because I think this is going to be relevant when we talk about why the pass rates are what they are. SQE1 is a very rigorous exam. Do you just want to give us a bit of an overview in terms of not the preparation, but the two papers themselves, and
Absolutely.
why it is so tough?
Yeah, I mean, you may have heard of this from your friends if they've done it already. The thing to understand is that in SQE1, you would sit two papers as they're split here. So, for example, paper one, you'll see, as Johnny said, you've got a combination of subjects that will be covered. So, contract, tort, and public broadly from what you've done before, dispute resolution and business law and practice, which will be new to you as part of preparing for SQE usually. You will do in that paper 180 multiple choice questions, the single best answer multiple choice questions in 5 hours and 6 minutes. And in that paper, over that 5 hours, 6 minutes period, you will have those questions will be delivered to you in a random order. So you might open with a business question, you might then do two contract questions, you might then get a public, then a dispute resolution, then two business, etc. Okay, so the really important thing to understand about these assessments is you need to be really comfortable and familiar with all of the different subjects which are assessed, so that you're comfortable then to bounce between them and it doesn't phase you at all that you're moving from contract to tort without blinking. A really good thing to understand, just in case you're horrified by the 5 hours, 6 minutes, is that there is a break in halfway through. So basically, say you had an exam that started at 9 in the morning, you'd do 2 hours 33 from 9 o'clock. You'd have an hour's break at about 11:30. At about 12:30, you'd then do another 2 hours 33. So by the end of that, you would have done your 5 hours, 6 minutes and hopefully answered 180 questions. But it is rigorous. The other thing to understand is that they're taken in Pearson VUE test centres, so the kind of places many of you might have undertaken your driving test. So you sit at a computer in an invigilated room. It is completely closed book. You don't take in anything of your own equipment. You're given a little whiteboard and a pen, and that is literally you for the purposes of the exam.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. So, having set the scene that you've got these two 180 multiple choice question papers that you sit roughly a week apart, um, we have a question for you, Caroline, here, that was asked me in advance. Although this isn't about pass rates, this number is quite important because it will determine what the pass rates are ultimately. What is the pass mark for each of FLK1 and FLK2? And without wanting to go into too much detail in terms of the statistical science of it, could you explain how it's calculated? Because it's not just a question of how many questions you get right, is it?
Well, it's kind of a two-stage process. So what happens is once the papers have been sat by the thousands of people who will sit them these days, there is a process that goes on where a panel of people in the background who are solicitors work out how difficult the paper was. And as a result of that, they'll work out what the pass mark for that paper is. And usually the pass mark is effectively in the high 50s, say. So that's our basic point. But everybody's actual mark is then put through a scaled scoring process. Okay, so what they say is it's only fair to do this because one paper might have been slightly harder than another paper. So having established how difficult each of the papers is, they then say, right, we're going to work on the assumption that 300 out of 500 for the paper is a pass. We're going to look at a particular person's result and say, or their what we call their raw score, so the number out of 180 that they get, and we're going to say, well, do you know what, that paper was difficult. So the scaling process for that person will mean that it will be boosted relative to their raw score. And you'll be able to see that in what they're then converted to as a scaled score out of 500.
And
Similarly,
Caroline, just to jump in there, just to
yeah.
be clear, because I think some people may not be aware, why are there different papers? Why doesn't everyone sit the same paper?
Oh, very good point, Johnny. I should have started with this. So the point at this stage in the SQE journey is there are so very many people who sit in each sit that they have to put on multiple papers over the course of a week for each of FLK1 and FLK2. Very important thing to understand. Jessica's just asking, when we say the high 50s, yes. So percentage wise, the pass mark will be set in the high 50s according to what they decide. That actually is less important than what your scaled score is, given that the scaling happens, but technically in the background that is established. So converse to what I was saying before, so if you ended up doing what ended up being decided to be a bit of an easier paper, you will see when you see your raw score in your results, you'll see that actually you were scaled down slightly in order to make sure that your result was comparable with the one for the person who did a slightly harder paper. So the key thing to understand when you get your results for SQE1, and this is very much made clear in your results, did you get 300 or above out of 500 once your result has been scaled? If you did, happy days, you passed. If you did not, then you won't. But it does say in the results, very helpfully, pass or not pass. So you don't have to work it out for yourself. It's very, very clear.
And Emma has said, does that mean everyone gets different questions, or if you sit on the same day, do you get the same questions as everyone else who sits that day?
So
How
it's
does it
the
work?
second of those, Johnny. So everybody who sits a paper that starts at 9 o'clock on the Tuesday will have the same questions. They'll have them in a different order because they're randomised in the order they appear to each candidate. But you will get the same questions as a few hundred people, but not as everybody else who sat in your sit.
And that's the critical thing. And the way that the scaling happens, and sort of to make it all fair, is that there are common questions that are sat by students across the sit, but also questions that have been used in previous papers. And therefore, there is data to show which papers are harder than others,
Yeah.
depending on how people are performing. So there's been enough exams now for the data to be there for the pass uh, for people to work out whether a paper overall is harder or easier than the next one.
Yes. I'm just going to answer a couple of the questions that are just coming in the chat just because they're relevant to exactly what we're talking about. How do you know whether you had a harder or an easier paper? That is literally by looking at what your raw score was out of 180 and seeing what that is relative to what your scaled score is. And you can calculate for yourself whether or not you were scaled up or scaled down. But as Johnny says, I think it's fair to say we have good confidence in this process because they have been scaling now for the last few sits and it seems to be pretty well embedded now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wouldn't get overly exercised with how
No.
your pass mark is actually calculated. There is a process. From what we can see, it appears to be fair, and therefore trust the process is what the SRA would say. There's one caveat on that that I'll highlight when we look at some of the data later on, but by and large, we have to trust the process. Ultimately, people who are getting, as Caroline has said, in the sort of high 50s maybe percent of questions right are passing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you get 58% you definitely will pass, because
Yeah.
if your paper was easier than the rest then you might be scaled down slightly. But there we go. Right, now we talked about we're going to talk about pass rates rather than pass marks. So there's a difference, of course. Pass mark is, the point at which you become a successful candidate rather than one who doesn't pass first time. But the pass rates are obviously the percentage of people that are getting over the line to actually pass. Oh, before we do that, we would just want to briefly talk about. I think you've mentioned it briefly about SQE2. We'll come back to that in a moment. I wanted to talk to you about the actual pass rates for students nationally, Caroline, first, before we go back to look at SQE2. Does the SRA publish pass rates for SQE providers and their courses, or yeah, how do we find out how what the pass rates are?
Well, what the SRA publishes to date is the data for everybody who sat in each sit. And I mean, they give quite a good statistical analysis across the board. They break it down by gender and race and all sorts of different categories. Um, they haven't yet published provider data. That's something that is due to come in the next little while, but at the moment is not something that is published by the
Yeah,
SRA.
that's right. And um, yeah, Clara and I are party to information that's not public knowledge yet, that the SRA has published, has promised to publish data by the end of the year. Obviously, we are a month away from the end of the year, and I'm sure the SRA will update us on their plan to, in relation to the publication of pass rates for SQE providers. But at the moment, we don't receive them. So when it comes to pass rates for individual providers, it gets quite tricky, because how do candidates know how one provider is doing rather than another? So I'm going to ask you to look at the polls now. You can see on the screen, folks, before we start to look at the data nationally, because there's only limited amount of data that there is on providers. But I want you to have a look at the poll on the screen, if you can do, and answer this question that you can see on the screen now. Oops, where I've gone backwards. Sorry. Um, Here we go. How many SQE providers do you think have published their SQE pass rates so far? We'll see you complete the poll. So complete the poll now and we'll have a look. Just give you another few seconds to do so. A few more votes. Interesting. I think we're waiting for the votes to come in here, but it's very interesting to see that the audience is quite well informed, I think, generally speaking, aren't they, Karen? I don't know if you can see the results of the poll, but
No, I can't actually.
I can tell you. So the answer to the question is only 3 providers have provided their pass rates so far. I will explain possibly why we think that is in a moment. But 35% of you or thereabouts got that right. Uh, those providers, I'll let you find out who they are apart from BPP in your own time. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, Caroline, that only 3 providers out all the ones out there have actually decided to share their pass rates. What's the rationale, do you think, for them having not shared, or
Well,
um,
one thing that is a new thing about this regime, which all of us have as a challenge, is that the SRA doesn't tell us how our students have done. So we have to go to them and say, please tell us how you've got on. And um, we ask them to share their transcript with us so that we can understand the breakdown. We can use it to help inform the next round of our teaching, help us make sure we're providing students with what they need. But that is not an easy thing. And, students don't necessarily get round to sending it to us. So actually having the data, if you're a provider, getting the data is actually quite challenging. And Johnny and team around him work very hard with our students to make sure that they do provide us with that data to allow us to publish pass rates.
But I think it would be naive to think that providers don't know or have some indication of how their students are doing.
Mm,
I don't think any provider is going, well, the SRA don't provide us the data, we're not going to find out how our students are doing. That would be nonsense. But ultimately, providers, only three of them have decided to publish their data. And I've got a theory, this is only a personal theory, it's not BPP's, that obviously there are some people that have to be top of the league, and there are some people who are middling and some people who are bottom. And obviously the people who are bottom of the league aren't going to want to publish their pass rates.
yeah.
People who are middling don't want to look to be middling. And it's only the ones that are quite confident and happy with their pass rates that tend to publish. Although, you might argue that one that has published qualifies it so heavily, it's not really a pass rate that they've announced at all. But I'll leave that for you to judge when you do your own research on pass rates, folks. So that's my personal view in terms of why so few providers have published. But yeah, and I would say again, a personal view, it's absolutely scandalous 4 years on from the start of the SQE when the SRA promised faithfully and were committed to publishing pass rates for providers, that 4 years on we still haven't got there. And we're waiting, we're promised the data um, from the July 2025 assessments by the end of the year. Well, we'll see what happens. I'm sure the SRA will make an announcement shortly in terms of where they are on that. Okay, now let's talk about the national pass rates, because this is quite something that a lot of people are very concerned about. And I'm sure many people who are watching this webinar at the moment, Caroline, will be aware that the national first sit pass rate, which is the first set of numbers to the left you can see there, is very, very low indeed. In fact, for July 2025, it was the lowest ever national pass rate of 46%. And if you were including resitters, it was 41%, but first sitters, it was 46%. So less than 50% are passing. And if you look at the rest of the figures there, apart from January 25, no sitters got above 60%. Well, no sit has got above 60%. I mean, what does that tell us about the SQE1 without stating the obvious? Well, I think you probably do need to state the obvious, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two particular things to think about here. First of all, it's very challenging, and we've talked about this already. There's no point shying away for anybody's sake from the fact that it's hard. It's a lot to do. It's a lot to remember. It's quite an arduous assessment. So that's the first factor. But the second factor is there is nothing that you need to do to qualify to sit SQE1 other than to sign up for a place and pay your money. So there is no requirement to have done a quality preparation course to get to the point where you are sitting the exam. And I think even though, this data is out there and people must be beginning to understand that it's so very challenging, there are still, I think, significant numbers of people who go into their first sit underprepared. And it's a shame because it's a lot of money. But I think that is partly why this data is
Yeah, I
as
think
low
I,
as it
I
is.
think so, and I think a lot of people are tempted by cheap, quick courses because, yeah, let's face it, it's an expensive journey to do the SQE, and nobody's saying otherwise. And it's very tempting and everyone wants everything to be sorted as quickly as possible, try and
Yeah.
qualify as quickly as possible, and there are cheap courses out there. Let's give it a go. And I think a lot of students are quite naive looking at the numbers that they assume that because they passed every exam up to this point in their careers, and wannabe solicitors will have failed virtually nothing, if anything, up
Mm.
to this point. Why should I be one of the ones who are going to fail? Well, when you look at the data, which we're going to show in a moment, and drill down to these numbers even further, you will see actually there's absolutely no reason why anybody is guaranteed to pass in SQE, whatever your background, whatever your schooling, whatever your degree classification. It doesn't buy you anything other than an opportunity to sit. So obviously we're very proud of our numbers here in terms of the reason we consistently are at the top of the published SQE pass rates. I think part of the reason is the point that Caroline's mentioned. There are comprehensive, the courses aren't regulated, but we have a really comprehensive course that has many aspects to it, which means students pass. I mean, I suppose the face-to-face or live teaching element, whether you do it online or not, probably has something to do with it, doesn't it, Caroline?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's right. You've already mentioned our online teaching is very like being in the classroom, so it's a very interactive experience as well. But there is such a quantity to learn of information that actually having it structured by having classes and you're then motivated to do the preparation work so that you can attend and really make the most of your teaching, I think people find to be a very useful structure. Self-studying the quantity of work that you need for SQE1 would be extremely challenging for anybody.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I do occasionally point the finger at the SRA with a number of things. They do have a habit of putting up the one person who's a bit like Mike from Suits, who can literally study from online materials for next to nothing and go, let's see, you don't have to do a big expensive course. Well, for every one of those people, there are 99, maybe 999
Mm,
who would enhance their chances of passing significantly by doing a much more comprehensive live talk course, either in a classroom or in a live online session. BPP or there are other providers out there, but
mm.
there are many providers that are offering a little bit on sometimes no tutor contact, and that's so much. Yeah, you deserve a lot more than that to give yourself the better chance of passing the SQE.
And one point I would just add here, do you remember when I was talking about the SQE regime up front? And I talked about the fact you don't have to have a law degree. You can just have a degree. You're just showing that you're somebody who can achieve an undergraduate qualification, basically. Um, for our programs, actually, because we acknowledge how important it is to have a really solid background, we actually require students either to have done a law degree or to have done a proper law conversion course rather than anything else, because we think that that then sets you up the best possible way to go in and do your final preparation and really stand the best possible chance of achieving in SQE1 first time round.
Yeah, indeed, and that's the expectation of many of the firms that we showed you on that slide earlier. And if you attended Legal Cheek's law fair earlier this week, many of the firms at the booths you would have visited come to BPP, and almost all of them insist that their non-lawyers do a comprehensive
Law
um,
conversion course.
conversion course because it puts you on a level playing field with your LLB counterparts. And no matter how good a crash course is in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is that there are them out there, it's never going to take you to the breadth and depth that's required, not just for the SQE, but for practice as well. And that's why law firms really take that view.
Mm,
Um, just when it comes to pass rates as well, it's very important to say that our pass rates are assessed as we've mentioned, across all our cohorts. Yes, we can't get the result of every student for the reason why Caroline has mentioned, and we are putting the SRA under an enormous amount of pressure to share their results for all of our students with us because we're very confident we'll still be top of the table anyway. But we do go out there, we survey all of our students who are due to sit for the first time in a particular sit, and we get lots of results back. And then the numbers you can see on the screen are our pass rates, which we are indeed very, very proud of. Okay, now I mentioned earlier that no one is guaranteed to pass SQ1 quite clearly. Um, and sorry, the next slide. I wanted you just to on the chat if you could answer this question. There isn't a poll, but if you could in the chat. I mean, obviously there isn't a single number here, but just give me an idea what you think the pass rate is for students with first class degrees. So first class degrees, obviously there'll be a range of numbers which we'll show you in a moment. But yeah, if you've got a first, what do you think your chances are of passing SQ1 is? see, we'll wait for some numbers to come up. There's a slight delay in me being able to see your answers. So just pitch in a number. No answer is a wrong answer because it's probably within the range anyway. Okay, we're starting to get the numbers coming in now. So we've got ranging from 30 odd percent to 60%. Quite interesting. That pretty much, yeah, really interesting. Quite a whole range. Now, thank you everybody for your contributions on this. It's incredibly varied, and we're going to show you something that might shock you now. The pass rate, if you were a first sitter and a first class degree graduate, was 80% in January, 67% in July. So if you look at the July stats, a third of people with first class degrees actually failed at the first attempt. I find that absolutely staggering, don't you, Caroline?
Yeah, it is extraordinary.
And that's the reason why, you know, you need to really look at how you prepare for the SQE, because no student is guaranteed a pass. And I suspect a lot of people who are quite academic thought, well, I can do this on the cheap because I've never failed an exam, I got a first. And then they come a cropper that way, which is obviously very disappointing, and is not really what the system's meant to do. It gets a little bit worse, I'm afraid, for as you might imagine, for students with two ones. They tend to be more or less tracking very often the national pass rate for the particular exam, as you can see on the screen there. Again, a lot of students will either get two ones or first who are looking at the SQE. Doesn't guarantee you anything. And then if we go and look at the two twos, and again, this shouldn't be a reason for somebody not to do the SQE, but you should go into the whole assessment regime with open eyes. That the students who have two twos, the prospects of passing are about 1 in 5. Again, that is something that, you know, shouldn't really be the case, but I'm afraid it is, and it clearly is the case that the better your degree classification, the better your chances of passing, I suppose.
There's a very clear correlation, isn't there? Various people in the chat are asking about what on earth happened in July, and really the answer to that in basic terms is that the composition of those sitting in January and those sitting in July is generally a bit different. And the last couple of July sits, we've seen a trend where the July marks have been quite a lot lower. But of course, it's still quite early days, so it's quite difficult for anybody at the moment to give hard and fast sort of conclusions. But I
Hmm.
think it is probably the case that the percentage of sitters in January is more from sponsored firms and that sort of thing than in July.
Yeah, and they will tend to have obviously slightly better candidates in terms of just the
Yeah.
ability to pass, which I think you probably expect. But I think the troubling thing I have is with this stat here, in that is it really the case that the first class candidates are performing so much worse in July compared to January? Are they all of a particular type of demographic, which means are they sitting in July rather than January? Uh, I personally don't buy that. I think there's something else going on, and I think the SRA need to look at why there's such a massive difference
Mm.
in first
But
class candidates, because I find that discrepancy between those two numbers quite troubling.
yes, there is also just I've said about composition, but it's also number of sitters, isn't it,
Hmm.
Johnny? There
Yeah.
are there are significantly fewer sitters in July. I mean, still a lot of people, but there are
Still
significantly fewer
several
sitters in
thousand
July.
though. So you would have thought that there's a
Mm.
representative sample. There's enough in the data there for it to be meaningful. But again, yeah, it's something that, yeah, we are early days, and it's something that I hope the SRA will look into in a bit more detail than perhaps just simply say past academic um, record is a direct correlation to success, which you can clearly see. Now, one of the reasons why we wanted to sort of bring you this session talking about pass rates is that the effect of failing an exam is quite significant financially, isn't it, Caroline?
Mm. Yeah, the terms and conditions for the exams, for these assessments with the SRA, are quite different from ones that you would have met in an undergraduate degree generally, in that say you enter SQE1, so you're paying just under £2,000 to enter SQE1. Say you just failed both papers. For the next sit, you will pay that same amount again, or whatever the updated fee amount is. You don't pay a nominal amount for a resit in the way that you might in university. So that's really a strong reason to go in hard first time, having been really well prepared on the assumption you would hope against hope that you would only have to pay it once. One thing I would add to that is that if you only failed one of them, you would only have to pay half of that. But that's still a fairly significant amount of money.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And again, all boils back to cheap and quick for a course might end up being a false economy, because if
Yeah.
you are going to pass first time with a more comprehensive course, then it might be that you end up spending less than if you have 3, 4 resits across your whole SQE journey. And in fact, you could have up to 5 and still, you could have up to 4 and still get over the line, I suppose. Or no, you could have, yeah, you could have 6 sits actually and still pass overall,
Yes.
couldn't you? Yeah,
I would think that would be fairly stressful, but yes, you
yeah,
could.
yeah. Well, you can imagine how much that costs somebody, and
Oh, I wouldn't even want to think about it.
yeah,
Goodness.
yeah.
Yeah.
It could cost you 15,000 in fees at today's rates, which is well, just nobody's got that money really. Anyway, that is the reason why we're bringing you these messages, that pass rates do matter when you're choosing your provider, because you don't want to have to pay for resit fees, and there's a high risk no matter what. Marilia, a really good question. What we'll do is we'll give you some tips in the networking session, the second part of the session. We'll just try and keep our focus on pass rates for the rest of this session. But yeah, we're very happy to have a much more generalised SQE session, Q&A in the networking session at 5 o'clock. Well, we've got about just over 10 minutes to go. There's a few other slides we're just going to take you through. And these are the results of the national pass rate and BPP's results for SQE2. Just remind everybody, SQE2, it's the skills paper. How is the
Yeah.
skills? How are the skills made up before we look at these numbers?
Do you mind going back to that slide, Johnny, just so people can see?
Yes, that
It's
probably would
it's a
be
few
helpful, wouldn't
earlier,
it?
isn't it?
Yeah.
But I touched earlier on the fact that you've got a mixture of oral skills and written skills. So the way that these are assessed is that the written skills, starting with those, are assessed in Pearson VUE test centres. So in a similar way to the SQE1 exams, you might end up sitting SQE2 written skills in the same place as your SQE1. Whereas the oral skills exams are, believe it or not, actually done face to face. And they're done, there's only 4 cities in England and Wales where they're undertaken at the moment. So many people sitting SQE2 oral skills do have to travel for the purposes of sitting the exams. So the thing that is really challenging about SQE2 is that they want to assess you in a number of different legal contexts in each of all of these skills. So you'll see at the top it says 16 tasks with no choices. So when you sit SQE2, you will do 5 half days worth of assessment. Some of those will be oral, some of those will be written, and then all of them are quite short. So between half an hour and an hour per task. And then once you've done all of those things, all of your efforts in all of those different mini exams will be pulled together, and then your mark is generated as a result of that. And for SQE2, they're scaled in a similar way to SQE1 to make sure that everybody's mark is comparable. But what you get at the end of SQE2, once you've been through all of that, is you get a single pass-fail outcome. And if you didn't pass, you would have to redo the whole thing again.
So
So
that's paying the full 3,000 or
it
thereabouts
is, and
again.
it's quite a marathon. The good news is, and Johnny's going to get us to that slide. The good news is that the pass rates on SQE2 are much better than they are for SQE1.
Why is that? Because that's a market difference. I know the answer. I'm playing devil's advocate here.
He's just checking. I know the answer to this.
Of course, you know.
The answer is that, of course, SQE1 acts as a primary filter for SQE2. You can only book SQE2, sorry, if you've passed SQE1, which means that you've only got the stronger candidates going into SQE2. And some people don't pass because, as you can tell, it's quite a challenging undertaking. And remember, I said earlier on, you're applying those skills in a series of legal contexts, and you've got to remember all the law from SQE1 for those legal contexts. So there's a lot going on for you in SQE2. But overall, people do much better, although our students tend to do a little bit better than that, as you can see on the slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're tracking for the July sit around about.
Results are only just out, aren't they,
Yeah,
Johnny,
I
for
know,
those
but
who...
yeah, but I've got most of our data in so far,
Oh, fantastic.
and we're tracking double figures above the national pass rate. So I reckon we'll have a pass rate in the 90s
Oh,
by the
wow.
time we finish that. So we'll be consistent
Brilliant.
with all the other sits where we have had a
Mm,
pass rate in the 90s. So
yeah.
it's really obviously very encouraging for our students, and we're obviously very proud of how hard they work. I think one of the reasons why we have a very strong pass rate for SQE2, and this is not what a lot of other providers do. We do a lot of classroom teaching
Yeah.
for the SQE2 skills. I think when the SQE2 first came out, a lot of providers thought, oh, we can do this on the cheap. We can just give a lot of examples of how to do stuff, and students can learn from a book and basically do it all online. And we really we've challenged that and said, actually, no, the best way for students to learn is by it being modelled in the classroom by tutors, but also by other students, and
Mm.
getting feedback there and then on the skills, which is absolutely
And
essential,
then
I think.
doing practice sits, don't they?
Yeah.
Ahead of the centralised, they actually go through a whole series of assessments, just like they will in the centralised, and people find that very, very useful.
There's a really good question here from Ramadan, because I was going to bring this up actually. Before we answer Ramadan's question, do you just want to explain why LPC students or LPC graduates might have to take SQE2?
Yeah, so this is a feature of the times we are in, and it will become less of a feature as the years go by. But at the moment, I think, Ramanan, you might be somebody like this. You've got quite a few people out there who've done the LPC, but they haven't managed to get a training contract. So perhaps they're paralegaling or whatever it might be, but they're not a qualified solicitor, because under the LPC rules, you used to need to do technically what was called a training contract. There are transitional provisions under the SQE regime that mean that an LPC grad can effectively switch tracks to the SQE route with their LPC in their pocket. They then don't need to do SQE1, but they do need to do SQE2 and qualifying work experience, be of suitable character, and that will allow them to qualify under the kind of transitional route. The challenge for those LPC students is that the coverage of the LPC was a bit different in terms of the law it covered from the SQE. The two main things I would say: first, in the LPC, you weren't assessed again on contract, tort, land trusts, etc. But you did, of course, need to have learnt those to be allowed to do the LPC. But for you, it might be quite a long time ago. And the other thing is, there are two particular areas which the SQE assesses much more on than the LPC did. The first of those is wills and probate, which was quite light on the LPC and is much more important for the SQE. And the other is criminal law and practice, which again was quite light on the LPC. It's quite a lot more substantively assessed on the SQE. So lots of people, Ramadan, have done that switch. But I think the thing to really understand is, as an LPC grad, you've got quite a lot of work to do on the functioning legal knowledge that you will need for SQE2 to make sure that you are in a position to be able to do really well in SQE2.
Yeah, and to answer Raman's question, just to complete that, we at BPP will provide resources, materials, so that you can get that black letter law up to the standard that you need for SQE2. Otherwise, obviously, as Caroline has identified, there's big information gap there, or knowledge gap, or at least memory gap, probably in many people's cases, because it's a long time since you studied some of that material, and some of the material you won't have studied at all. So really important that you look at that. And I think one thing to say about SQE2 is that the SRA has, in previous reports, there's a whole web page with loads of reports on SQE exams, but also yearly reports as well. There does seem to be a disproportionate number of LPC students failing SQE2 compared to those that have been through the whole of the SQE1 process. And I think that's for the reason that
Yeah.
Caroline identified, that they have found it found it harder to get themselves ready. But I also think a number of SQE2 LPC graduates doing SQE2 have not necessarily invested in a course, and they've tried to
Yeah.
wing it.
And the other thing probably there, the other feature there, Ramanan, if you've done an LPC, you'll know that you've done some legal drafting, you've done some legal writing, etc. Really important for an LPC grad to understand that in the LPC, you are being held to the standard of a day one trainee. In the SQE2, you're being held to the standard of a day one qualified. And in some ways that makes little difference, but in some ways it does make quite a big difference. So it's important an LPC grad doesn't think, oh, drafting, that's fine, I've done that, I can just turn up and do it, because you need to partly realize you need to elevate your level, but partly you just need to make sure, as in any kind of exam like this, that you're answering in the way that the SRA and Kaplan are expecting you to answer in order to maximize credit for the purposes of passing SQE2.
Sure. And Gayan's asked a question that I can't answer directly about sort of comparing us with one of our biggest competitors, but I think what makes BPP's course different, which partly answers your question, is the focus on live teaching across the whole of the SQE journey, and in particular SQE2. I think we do more live SQE2 teaching than most of our competitors will do, and I think that is reflected in the rates you can see on the screen in front of you. And our results are top of the tree compared to our competitors in terms of what we've published. So we must be doing something right, and I think it's a reflection of the great relationships we have with firms, the amount of preparation, the years of preparation before the SQE came into force that we put in, and research and design that went in to bring our course to where it is now. That hasn't happened by accident. That's gone due to a significant amount of investment of time. We're experts in this area. We've been teaching, as Caroline said right at the beginning, for years, people to qualify as solicitors. We know what we're doing. And there are lots of materials out there from some from providers, some just on random websites, where there's relatively little track record, if any, or quality control for many candidates to be happy with. Whereas obviously we've got a very good reputation for many years in this space. Listen, we are tracking round to time. I just wonder whether there's any other questions, Caroline, that you may have seen that perhaps might warrant a chat, or is there anything
I
rather
think
than parking
probably
it?
these are more ones for the next hour, 'cause some quite bespoke questions here about
Okay.
individual situations. So not so much about pass
Mhm.
rates and pass marks.
Okay. Well, the final thing I'll just leave with you folks is just choosing the right SQE prep course for you. And obviously, we would say, given what the pass rates are that we've announced and compared it to other providers that have published, and the majority that haven't, obviously BPP should be the place to go. But it's sometimes more complicated than that, and you can see all the factors on the screen in front of you that you will have to weigh up one way or the other in terms of what's important. I know what, because I've done the research myself, is really important to students, and that's cost and affordability. I completely get that. My advice is that it's not a race to qualify. You're much better advised in saving up the money to buy the course that you think is going to get you over the line as quickly as possible, and with the least stress as possible, rather than trying to do it quick and cheap, because that could be, as we've identified, a recipe for disaster that over 50% of candidates are facing with the SQE. And one of the other reasons to come into BPP for a comprehensive course is that if you do our masters, it does attract funding from student finance, which actually means that a lot of the money you need to finance is already there through student finance. So do
If
look at
you're a
that as an option.
domestic student, Johnny, I
Yeah,
think it's important to say.
absolutely right.
And it's
Absolutely
your
right.
first masters.
Yeah, yeah. Right, so we've clocked round bang on 5 o'clock. Thank you so much. We'll bring in Julia here, who will give you some directions as to what's happening in the second hour.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Johnny and Caroline. That was very, very helpful, and I'm sure everyone found that very insightful. So obviously this brings us to the end of the presentation part of the session. So if everyone could cast their eyes to the Expo booth button on your screens, we will now be moving over there for our networking session, which will run, I think, until 6 o'clock. And you'll be able to ask all those very bespoke questions to Johnny and Caroline. So keep those in mind if you've put them in the stage chat, and don't forget to ask them again. I'm once again going to point everyone's attention to our SQE FAQ page, which will be posted in the chat imminently, as well as our editorial. Those are both very useful resources if you want something to look at after this session, but I'm sure we'll have lots more information coming your way in the next hour. Expect the booth to be busy, so make sure you turn your camera on, ask your question, and then let other people have a go. But thank you once again for joining us this afternoon, and thank you once again to Johnny and Caroline.
Thank you, Julia. See you in the expo booth, everyone.
Bye bye.